everyone. Welcome to Open Source Stories. My name is Julia Ferrioli. It is, oh my goodness, it is December 17th of 2024. Still, I believe, is a wonderful gray, rainy day in Seattle, which is just how I like it because it means the mushrooms will have another shot at another flush. I am here today with Erin McKean. Erin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Erin McKean, and I use she, her pronouns mostly, but I'm perfectly happy with they. And I'm in Portland, which is like totally living up to the Pacific Northwest hype for the winter time now. It's gray and rainy, a little bit chilly.
So that Portland, we have to
Yes,
be careful about which Portland it is, right?
I usually differentiate them by saying I live in Donut Portland and not Lobster Portland.
That is a great and incredibly accurate way of distinguishing between the two. Yes.
People seem to get that right off, even people in Europe. Like I've had some very confusing just like conversations with people who thought I was in Maine.
Yes. I mean, it is closer to Europe than Donut Portland. So I can
Yes.
understand that. Yes.
Yes. Perfectly understandable.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. I thought I'd kick things off with a fun question. And and to everyone listening or reading, Erin has not heard this question before, so it's a complete surprise. Do you have a current favorite word?
Oh my goodness. Well, I get asked this question a lot.
I did not
But
know that, but I can understand why.
right. So, for people who don't know, uh I've been a lexicographer, right? Someone who makes dictionaries nearly all my adult working life. Like I started working on dictionaries before I even graduated from college. And so when you ask somebody who works on dictionaries like what their favorite word is, it's often like asking somebody like, "What's your favorite child?" Right? Well, I like them all. I like all of the words. Every word has a purpose and a use and a reason for being, or else it wouldn't be a word. But people don't like that answer because they really want me to have like a word, right? So I often say that a word that I really love is the word erinaceous. Because first of all, it's got my name in it, right? Erin.
Mm-hmm.
And it means of, like, or pertaining to hedgehogs.
Oh my gosh.
Of course, the downside of this is that people have started giving me hedgehog things, and I have like too many hedgehog things at this point. They're very cute. I love hedgehogs. I do not want like an actual live hedgehog, but like hedgehog things in general are cute.
Well, and I feel like they're like words, multifaceted. They can be cute, but they can also be a little bit scary. See also hedgehog babies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, can you repeat that word for
It's
me?
erinaceous.
Arenaceous. And that's with an
Yes.
E. Erin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because one of the Latin names for the hedgehog has Erin in it. It's like
Ah.
Arena. It's part of the like nomenclature for the species.
My brain wants to associate that somehow with erroneous, but I know that is erroneous.
No, hedgehogs are always extremely accurate. People really don't know that about hedgehogs, but they're very devoted to facts.
Okay, now I need a sticker that says extremely accurate hedgehog.
Yes, I think that
Yes.
yes.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to hear about your favorite word. I'm sorry it is not a novel question. I should have known better.
That's okay. I do love that question.
So, for those who don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about WordNick before we dig into the open source side of things?
Oh, sure. So yeah, WordNick is a very large online English language dictionary. I like to joke it's the biggest dictionary nobody's ever heard of. And It's a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. It started as a venture-backed startup, but we didn't make any money. But our investors were awesome and let me reincorporate it as a nonprofit. And I've been working on it since like 2007, which actually makes it very young in dictionary years.
That's true. When you compare it to like the Oxford English Dictionary or
Oh, yeah, it's
Merriam-Webster. Yeah.
larval stage when you compare it to the OED.
Right, right. But I actually I heard of Wordnik before we met. And
Oh,
so
awesome.
I was like, "Oh my goodness, I'm meeting the great Erin McKean." That was like a celebrity moment for me. Um, and I'm so glad that our paths have overlapped in open source land as well.
Yeah, like, well, Wordnik I kinda got into open source in a weird way compared to a lot of open source type people in that I got in through, like, Creative Commons,
Mhm.
because dictionary editors basically just are like gluttons for text because dictionaries are made by analyzing large scale text corpora. And we want as much access to as much text as possible in CC licensed text. Just beautiful, right? Chef's
Mhm.
kiss. Like we could analyze it, we could use it for things. Um, which I'm not going to go off onto my tangent about how the gobbly AI things are ruining open access text for everybody. Um, but yeah, so Wordnik obviously was a big uh we had we're big consumers of corpora. And I went to like one of the I summits in
Mhm.
Japan in like 2008, I guess. And then when I started doing more things with code, I was like, oh, there's like Creative Commons for code. Oh, it's called open source.
I think that's an awesome path into it though. It it provides you such like a foundational layer. Plus communication is so important in open source too.
Oh, absolutely. And
So,
it's it's nice when you're building something to have something available to you under a license that's very clear about what you're allowed to do with it.
mhm,
Because if you're thinking about things like fair use, right? Fair use is not a checkbox you can check. A whole bunch of people have to like be involved before something can be really declared to be fair use.
mhm.
Everything else is just kind of like a shrug and a like, looks like it to me. I'm not a lawyer, by the way. Please do not take this as legal advice.
We'll put a disclaimer. This is the disclaimer, but yes, we'll put an additional disclaimer.
Yes. My only legal advice is do not take legal advice from me.
I think I'm segfaulting. um, so coming in from this world of Creative Commons of dictionaries to open source, you must have kind of some interesting perspectives, takes on what open source has or how it's evolved over time and kind of like the different like
Yeah, like I've been
generations
thinking
and eras of open source that we're seeing.
I I have been thinking about uh, like open source um in a little bit because we met because I I'm paid by Google now. That's my capitalism job. It's pretty good capitalism job as capitalism jobs go. And I work at the open source programs office. Nothing I say should be taken as like the position of Google. But like one of the great things about working in open source is that, you're on the outside and the inside at the same time.
Mhm.
And that gives you like an interesting perspective. Whatever company you work for, you're also part of the open source community. And so, like, speaking in my capacity as a private citizen, I've been thinking a lot about how open source has changed, even in like, you know, the 20-ish years that I've been vaguely aware of it, right?
Mhm.
And maybe it's just part of being like older, and that now I start thinking about things more of like, oh, there's a history to this. There are layers. And I've been thinking about open source as maybe having like, Taylor Swift type eras or maybe layers. I was thinking like when open source first began, it was kind of in its like inventor era. everything was new. People were trying to come up with norms. Licenses were new. Just the very idea of sharing things like um, parallel to copyright, right?
Mhm.
Copyright's involved, but how can we give people a license to do what they want to do? Everything was new. Like, I don't want to use the word discovery because that feels kind of like colonialist to me, but
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
if things were being invented, things were being set up. And some of the things that were being treated as norms were maybe not things that we want to have as norms now, right? The idea that
Mhm.
like code is what matters the most. Or that like if you're just a kick-ass coder, we can excuse maybe some of the things that you do in your personal life that are not so nice to other people, right? That was a norm of
Yeah.
the time.
Mhm.
And so thinking of these as maybe like layers of the onion, right? That was like the first layer that got put down, the first era. And then the second era, and all of these things are kind of like still all happening at the same time because, everything happens everywhere all at once. But the second era was really like the community era, where we realized that like code that falls in a forest where nobody uses it or contributes to it or cares about it might as well not exist. So
Mhm.
like I'm thinking about that as like the Kubernetes era, right? Where everybody kind of came together, stone souped a thing out of the code that then became this enormous community, right?
Mhm.
How many KubeCons are they up to a year now? Is it like 11? Like
I mean,
there's just
I
like
think they just keep adding one every year.
right. But we realized that like what made code valuable wasn't necessarily just the code, it was the people around it and how they reached out to each other and how they helped each other and used things together to make things that were bigger than the sum of their parts.
Mhm.
So we've got the inventors and then we've got like the community. And now I think we're entering what I think for a lack of a better term, I'm calling our responsibility era,
Ooh.
right? Where we're thinking more about like, oh, as as people who create things, we have a responsibility to like, I don't know, manage our dependencies
Mhm.
or like tell people where things came from or um, give clearer guidance to users about what this code is good for and what maybe they shouldn't be using it for. And whether this responsibility is like externally imposed by regulation
Mhm.
or maybe it's just um the maturing of people and realizing that hey, sometimes consequences are unintended and we should try to have a little foresight about those things. And so this like responsibility era still has like code, it still has community, but now we're kind of adding this extra layer on top where we're like, hey, we also have to think about our externalities
The
and deal with
impact.
those as well.
Mhm. It it's interesting to me because as you're going through those eras, by the way, I definitely want you to come up with Taylor Swift albums for each one. Um, but you can also kind of think about it in terms of the scarcity being defined as what's scarce.
Yes.
Computing resources, people skills, baby. Um, and then, thinking long term and thinking about the the ethics, the morals and norms of a society. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
it's kind of like a fascinating way of viewing open source.
And I think that this happens like naturally as communities and domains mature,
Hmm.
right? Because the longer something is around, the longer or the more chances unintended consequences have to actually occur,
Hmm.
right? And so um maybe maybe fossil fuels aren't the right like metaphor, but like you burned a lot of open source code for 100 years before we realized that like, oh, it's burning out the maintainer community maybe.
That's a little maybe too close to home. That I dislike how well that resonates.
But once, you can't solve a problem until you recognize that there actually is a problem,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And and I think the solution to this problem is not maintainers do more, right?
Right.
It can't be. We can't just layer more responsibilities on top of maintainers. And I think I certainly have definitely been a kind of like lackadaisical developer where I'll pick a project that I want to use kind of based on vibes
Mm-hmm.
because I work in JavaScript, which, as we all know, is a vibes driven development ecosystem. And and then and then maybe like a year or two later, I'm like, oh, right. This hasn't been updated. And now I have to update,
Mm-hmm.
or I have to pick something else. Or yeah, so I feel like as consumers of open source, we have to be like a little bit more responsible. We have to read the label. We have to be willing to like give back more.
Mm-hmm. There's as much as there is not an obligation that is codified in the license, there's a philosophical obligation writ
It's really
large.
it's almost like a self-interest obligation too, right? Like if if you want open source to keep going, you can't just keep pumping water out of the, out of the bedrock.
Yeah. So is the like what is solar for open source? What's
Yeah,
solar energy for open source?
yeah, that is a really good question. And again, speaking just for myself, I feel like people need more slack in their lives, and that's a systemic issue that really can't be solved like just inside the open source community. But if you're if you're working like all the hours of the day for your capitalism job and your capitalism job isn't related to open source, where are those hours coming from to contribute, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have anybody to share your caregiving obligations and all the hours you're not working your capitalism job are spent in caregiving, where does your open source time come from? Like, there's a lot of systemic problems that affect people in all sorts of creative, like, avocations that we can't solve by ourselves in open source.
Yeah, it's one of those things where people love to say, oh, X, Y, and Z, they're not zero sum. Time is?
Time is zero sum, and I wish that it weren't
I
because I have so many projects and I really I plan to live to be 100, but still, like, I'm never going to get to them all.
I think based on the number of domains I've registered alone, yeah, there are more projects than there will ever be time.
Mhm.
And so, especially, you're talking about your capitalism job and making sure that you can keep afloat as a human being in the society that we're living in. Um, where is the give in the schedule? And where is there time for creativity that goes into our open source projects and our own in developing our own open source stories, right? Like it's just I don't know.
Yeah. Where's the slack in the system? Right? Like, without slack in the system, one accident backs everything up.
Hmm. Sometimes literally. Sometimes
Yes.
it's a like a bike accident and then you're out of the game for 6 months, right? And
Yep.
so like never mind a security incident, like both very, very critical issues.
Yeah.
So how do we give people more slack? What do we
I
take?
wish I knew. Like,
I,
and
mhm.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that brings to mind is one of our standard questions for our storytellers is what's bringing you joy. And I wonder if there's a way to promote joy driven development in open source.
I think a lot of people get into open source because of joy, right? The joy of creation, the joy of sharing, the joy of community. And then they get weighed down with the anti joy of paperwork, maintenance,
Mm-hmm.
entitled people opening issues where they haven't even bothered to like try to reproduce their problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's personally, I think it's fine for people to set boundaries to say, look, if you don't do this, I'm just closing this issue, right? You don't owe people more than they have brought to the interaction, right? If somebody comes to you with no care and no regard for your time,
Mm-hmm.
it's okay to say, come back when you've put some care into this.
Yeah. Where's the TLC in this?
Yeah. I feel
Yeah.
that something that's bringing me joy is that lately I've seen more and more people realize that, like, all we really have is each other. And if you can't be kind to other people and you can't support other people and you can't, like, be in a community of care,
Mm-hmm.
you don't really have anything at all.
Mm.
Like, there's no, like, rugged loner frontiersman, like, persona that you can adopt in an interconnected world that we have that will serve you in the long term.
Yeah, and especially if that's not your base operating, because
Yeah,
that's a really hard persona to adopt and still find satisfaction and joy. So,
yeah,
mm-hmm.
and, I'm pretty terrible about wanting to do all the things myself because I just enjoy doing things. So, I mean, come on, Julie, I make my own clothes. Like, this is not, like, a reasonable perspective to have. I wanna start making shoes, right? This is nonsense.
You're talking to a fellow nonsense because I just spent the better part of the morning stripping down candle wax to reuse. So, like,
Making things is fun, and, like, the feeling of, like, competence and being like, "Oh, yeah, I can do this thing," right?
yeah.
But, like, I really do, um I really do feel that there's also a muscle that has to be built up where you're like, "Hey, wow, I'm really bad at this kind of thing, and I really don't enjoy doing it, so who can I pair with that loves that kind of thing?"
So maybe it's bringing more types of joy seekers into open source because nobody
Yeah,
wants to do all the things. I don't want to fix security bugs. I'm bad at it. Come on.
right. There's always gotta be somebody who wants to bring the seven-layer dip to the potluck and somebody who wants to bring napkins.
Exactly. Different types of perspectives, different concerns, different skill sets and levels of investment. Like,
Yeah, and if you don't make space for the napkin bringers, everybody's gonna be wiping their hands on their pants, and it's just gonna be a terrible potluck.
very messy one. Yeah.
A very
No,
messy
nobody
pot.
wants that. Nobody wants that potluck. So I love that. So what is the fourth era?
Oh, fully automated luxury space communism? I don't know, like, I think
Okay.
I can't predict what's gonna happen next. I'm not very good at predictions because I always go straight to, like, the most science fictional outcome. I do feel like there's and, I don't wanna bring up the 2 worst letters in the English language right now, A and I, um, but I do feel there's still a lot of messiness there where we're trying to put things into a paradigm that maybe doesn't quite fit, and there's gonna be a lot of messiness until we figure out, like, what is the right metaphor? what
Mhm.
is the right analogy? And so who knows? Like, maybe the next era is the era of, you know, self-perpetuating automation,
Mm.
where humans do the squishy human things, and the code is hermetically generated inside a giant glowing orb.
Can the orb also be squishy? Because that sounds fun.
Ooh, a squishy glowing orb,
Squishy
like a
glowing
giant
orb, like the
a ball
sun.
of undifferentiated energy. Yes, that's the solar.
That's the solar. Please don't touch the sun, people. I don't recommend it. I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm pretty sure that would kill you. So,
I mean, that is a really good question. The sun is theoretically squishy, right? It's just we can't squish it. It doesn't have a hard surface. I mean, all
I
I know about the sun comes from like the They Might Be Giants song, so who knows?
okay, astrophysicists, what does the sun feel like? Your move. Come on, open source stories and tell us. We'll be waiting along with Taylor Swift for the next era open source album drop. So on that delightful note, I would like to thank you, Erin, for coming on Open Source Stories and talking about the responsibility era and what are some difficult and challenging but rewarding problems in open source.
Thanks so much for having me.